The race is on, and Fernando Alonso may have once had high hopes for 2026, but Aston Martin's testing struggles mean he faces, at the very least, a tough start to the season. So has his last chance to win again in F1 slipped away? And if so, what does that mean for his future? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me before they head to Australia for the first race of the season are Scott Mitchell-Malm and John Noble. Right, John, you're Fernando Alonso. You're about to head to Australia, where you look like you might be in a bit of a battle to beat the Cadillac drivers. You're 45. You've already hinted this is your last season. What is going through your mind?
I think low expectations. I don't think there's any sense of him going to Australia thinking we're on for a great weekend. There's going to be some strong fights and we can do something good. It is potentially even pondering how bad is it going to be? Is it going to be reliability dramas, headaches, not even getting to see what this car can do? Or is there going to be even a glimmer of some performance? So I don't think there's any anticipation that this is going to be a fun weekend.
Scott, to build on that a little bit, do you think that there'll also be a part of Alonso's mind which is thinking, oh, what's the point? And just thinking that time has run out on him and the Aston Martin dream just isn't going to happen on a timeline that works for him?
Well, I was thinking it's probably more just, how's this happened again? Like, how is this happening to me yet again? I mean, he's the driver who makes the, you know, whether they look good or bad on paper at the time, I guess is still subjective. But you look at them and all the decisions that he makes, that it's not like he joins someone on a total wing and a prayer. Like, there's always some kind of foundation to it. You know, even his F1 return with the Renault Works team, you can argue is like, you know, he's joining the midfield team that's not got any evidence of becoming a front runner, but it's still a Works team. It was the best route back into F1, and it was kind of a stopgap for him to kind of assess the competitive order. And nothing ever quite works the way that he wants it to work. But obviously with Honda specifically, like the parallels with 10 years ago and McLaren are just, yeah, they are unignorable. So that has to be in Alonso's mind, right? Like beyond, because if he's got to this point where he's still going, where he still finds ways to motivate himself over the winter, he still finds ways to believe. I can't really see that this setback will be the straw that breaks Alonso's back, because I think he's too wedded to the kind of competitiveness, the motivation, and I don't know, but the kind of unintended martyrdom of the latter part of his F1 career. Like he's got to have made his peace with that by now. So if there's anything that's kind of permeating the usual thoughts and concerns or whatever that he'll have going into the season, the only thing I can think of would be that element of just like here we go again.
Yeah, strangely familiar, won't it? It's absolutely unbelievable. Every time I think how long it's been since he won a Grand Prix, I mean, John, we were both there in Spain in 2013 when he won his last Grand Prix. He's been well regarded since. Yes, he took 2 seasons out, but the idea that we'd be 13 years later and Fernando Alonso still hasn't won another Grand Prix while racing largely in Formula One would be inconceivable.
Yeah, you wouldn't have believed it. And even in the start of 2023, when they were looking good, you thought this was the start of a rejuvenated Fernando with an Aston Martin team that was finally getting rolling. But that didn't play out. And I think even mid-year last year, I mean, he must have thought when Aston Martin signed Adrian Newey, you've got a Works Honda operation that finally nailed Formula One, super competitive. You've got Aston Martin's money, Adrian Newey on board, Honda looking good, a new rule set, new opportunity, everything thrown in early. All the ingredients were there to make a success. And I think I still think when we saw those first images of the Aston Martin rollout in Barcelona, just in all black carbon, it looked fantastic. And you thought, well, maybe this is the moment. Maybe Aston are going to do a surprise. It's been late, but this is going to be awesome. But that kind of dream lasted all of a few hours before Lance Stroll did 4 laps and stopped.
The element of Newey being part of this has to play into that kind of what more am I meant to do side of things for Alonso. He's been waiting so long to get his hands on a Newey F1 car, and he finally does, and they can't run it for long enough to work out if it's any good, let alone the idea that, I mean, obviously in hindsight, the McLaren-Honda partnership wasn't quite we've got a mega car, the engine's just rubbish narrative that was being spun heavily at the time, and not just like made up. Like people in McLaren sincerely believed that. They they were so held back by their own arrogance and ego. And Alonso kind of fed into that a little bit as well in terms of how he perceived the car versus what the engine was capable of. But you can see that repeating itself as well. If there's an element of like, well, we've got Newey, so it can't be the car that's the problem. And even if, we're not at that stage yet where we can say that with any degree of assurance, the car simply hasn't run enough to be able to work out what its problems are. It's clearly a limited and unrefined car based on testing, but what do you expect? It's not doing enough laps to really understand where the car needs to be pitched mechanically, what the balance needs to be, where it is on aero, where the weaknesses simply are on the chassis side. So, I mean, and to go back to your point, Ed, about the time without a win, I mean, I always lose track slightly with the years out in both parts of his career, both sides of his career. But were we already at the point where we'd had just as much of Alonso's career without a win as with a win, or are we reaching that this season? Because obviously he had 2 years out in the second half of his career, didn't he, and 1 in the first half. So it must be about there now. It must be like bang mid on for half of Alonso's career where he's a race winner and half of one of the longest F1 careers ever where he is not winning races or coming close.
Yeah, well, 2013 was his 12th season racing in Formula One. I think that accounts for the year he had as a test driver after that first Minardi year. So yeah, it's a bizarre career, and it just keeps getting more and more bizarre. And yeah, it looks like this could be another difficult chapter for him in that regard. And he must be wondering what he needs to do. And certainly there were some signs. There are a few little stories of testing where apparently his annoyance came through. I don't think he was surprised by where they were, because I think the writing had been on the wall for a bit, so those in the team knew there were maybe some concerns. So I don't think he got to testing and thought, oh no, this is a disaster. I thought it was going to be great. But he's probably not delighted with how poorly it's going. We've had a few questions from the Race Members Club on various Aston Martin related topics. We're going to throw those in during the podcast, but we've got a couple of directly Alonso related ones. So John, we'll come to you first with a question from Andrew Goddard, who says, is Fernando going to be needing his folding chair for another Honda disaster, given concerns about both the inherent reliability of the engine and whether they can push development without proper time? It's hard to see him not having an antagonistic moment at some point this year, isn't it?
I'm absolutely convinced that in the back of his head is playing out the scenarios of, at what point do I say something in public? At what point do I do something? I'm sure, that the GP2 engine comment, for example, is in the back of his head. I'm sure he's well aware of the deck chair moments. But one of the geniuses of kind of viral moments like those is that they come spur of the moment, that they aren't pre-prepared. So I'm sure there's going to be some strange circumstances where if the Aston stops on track, something strange is going to happen. Be some weird quirks of circumstance that will make what is an innocent moment become a big talking point. But I think the only positive for Fernando in this scenario is that things are so bad and people know where the problems are and they've been so exposed by pre-season that actually doesn't need to say anything, doesn't need to put more pressure on Honda, because Honda are well aware of what the problem is. They're well aware of the weaknesses. The weaknesses are front and center of stage and need resolving. And I think he's too smart a cookie to throw his toys out of the pram in public. There'll be a few comments, but I think he will hold back early on, hope that some progress is being made, and then the politics will come later on if that direction of travel isn't moving forwards.
So we don't think there's going to be the inverse of now we can fight in Australia. Maybe it'll be a now we can finish if he manages to limp to the line. I guess one thing I did wonder about Alonso, using that kind of wit and spur of the moment targeted comment that he's so good at, whether it's a blessing or a curse that Japan's so early in the season, because you could look at it as it's going to be almost at the peak of the problems unless they do have a fix, and we'll get on to the problems specifically later on. But if they do have something that can at least address the reliability early, maybe it'll be fine for Japan. But I struggle to see how it won't be either or both underperforming and unreliable in the first part of the season. So Japan could be difficult, and so therefore Honda's home race, the potential for embarrassment is quite high. But could also look at it as it's going to come so early that there won't have been enough time passed for everything to have soured. So if it was later in the year, maybe that's when he'll drop a modern day GP2 engine comment, because he'd be fed up by that point. And it might be that Japan being early in the season helps with that. I think he'll be, as much as Alonso can be when he wants to be honest, I think he'll be on good behaviour early on, but he will say enough to let us know what he's thinking. If he feels he needs to, I'm pretty sure he'll find a way to communicate something without, torching the entire bridge immediately.
I also wonder if the focus of Fernando's comments early on won't be about Honda and Aston directly. They'll be about the rules, because if the rules can change, if you can bring down energy deployment, pull it down to 250 or even 200, if you can increase the benefits from super clipping and get that equation done of how easy it is to harvest and how little you need to deploy, then that is hugely beneficial to one of Honda's weaknesses. So I do wonder if actually he's going to go more aggressive against the rules and need to change the rules, and this is unsafe if we carry on like this, because the biggest step's going to come from a rule tweak, getting those numbers balanced, than anything Honda and Aston can do independently.
Yeah, I certainly think strategically in those terms. And yeah, I do agree that probably it's handy for Honda that Suzuka comes so early this season. If it was in its more traditional slot towards the back end of the year, his outlook may be a little bit different. And incidentally, that GP2 engine comment, the famous one there, he definitely pre-planned that one, because he said it multiple times to make sure that it got picked up, apparently. So I think that's a classic example of Alonso, who's always whinging about, they take comments out of context and put it into the coverage. He knows full well what he says is going to get picked up, and he's definitely one of the more active in saying things, playing to the gallery, I guess you could call it. But Scott, we've got a question from Andy Atkins, who says, do you think the form of Aston Martin and the promise of a possible Newey winning car might tempt Alonso to continue into 2027? And if not, who might be the next big name to fill his boots?
I've got no idea with Alonso in terms of what will motivate him to leave or stay. There was a lot of talk in Bahrain about, is he just going to call it quits halfway through the year, and not in a like that was a big rumor that he will. It was just an open question because it's so bad, and he's obviously at the very end of his F1 career. But he's talked kind of cryptically and not so cryptically over the last couple of years about what motivates him, whether or not he'd be inclined to stay if they're doing well, if he's more likely to stay if they're not doing well, because then he'd want to hang on and give him a bit more time. I don't know. It's really hard to tell. In terms of who would replace him, I think that list is getting shorter rather than longer, and that would be the kind of opposite you would have expected at the start of 2026 if everything was working. I noticed that the Max Verstappen Aston Martin rumours have quietened down a lot over the course of the last couple of months. Certainly the last few weeks of on-track running. But if you're any kind of top driver, the only reason you would go there in the next couple of years, unless there's an enormous uptick in performance, which is possible. I feel like we do need to stress at every turn when we're talking about Aston and Honda right now is that the ultimate potential is still there. It's just, it's looking further away. It's still looking like so much more of a project than it was meant to at this stage. So you're going to, as a top driver, you're going to need a massive payday and no better competitive option to go there. I don't think you're choosing to go there to spearhead it right now. They need to sort things out sooner. And if they sorted things out and it became a more appealing prospect for other top drivers, Alonso would probably want to stick around. So that is a tricky one to judge. I guess if I'm going to put a name in the mix, I don't see any of the leading drivers in the top 3 or 4 teams being on Aston's radar. I think it's more likely going to be, I don't know, maybe like the Williams drivers are probably a decent reference for who might target it if that project becomes something that has a vacancy, does still have that really high potential, and isn't worse than where they're at now. Then, yeah, a Carlos Sainz or an Alex Albon feels a bit more likely than a Charles Leclerc who's fed up with Ferrari, or George Russell who's maybe or maybe not being ousted at Mercedes, depending on which way the Verstappen rumour mills churn in that week.
He's got, I guess, 3 fundamental choices, Alonso, hasn't he? He can just say, oh, this isn't going to happen. This isn't working. I'm going to quit. I'm going to walk away. I'll go and do some other racing. Obviously, you could spin a narrative that says he may have other priorities emerging in life because he's got his first child due pretty imminently around Japan weekend. I think he could look to try and force a move, chase the dream somewhere else. That's probably the least likely, I'd have thought, but you never know. Or the other one is just stick with it. Let the Aston Martin thing play out. Trust in the potential of the Newey, the Honda, all of these things, and just hope that he's able to keep battling on to whatever age he needs to, that he can win some races. John, would any of those three, do you think, be more likely for him?
I think the more likely route is pondering carrying on. The only uptick to him in terms of the state that Aston Martin are in is that it has removed the potential for a big driver to swoop in. If they'd rocked up in Barcelona with an absolute rocket ship, dominated pre-season testing, going into the year looking as favourites, and this is an amazing partnership, then I think you would have top drivers thinking, oh, maybe Aston's the place to be 27 and beyond. Right now, there's got to be a very good reason as to why you'd want to abandon what you've got to a team that seems to be in this position, which I think strengthens Alonso's case. If he thinks he carries on, there is a possibility to make it go. And I think what will be going in the back of his head is that it would just be typical of his career that he would step back from what Scott has said is a project that involves Honda, Adrian Newey, the might of big money operation with Lawrence Stroll, state-of-the-art facilities, walks away, someone else comes in just as it hits the ground and gets running. So we saw it with the Honda operation and the switch from McLaren to Red Bull. A partnership that looked so terrible suddenly went on and was winning races and became title winners. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that this project can work and can deliver. The question is the time frame. And I think what Alonso, one thing Alonso will not want to do is walk away, think this isn't working, and then someone steps in and takes all that glory.
I'll leave the recovery side of things to later in the pod specifically. One thing on that is obviously it's worth pointing out, because I noticed this a bit around Bahrain with how people kind of talk about what happened last time. It did require Honda joining a completely different organisation. So at least Alonso can be safe in the knowledge that if it's going to happen again, it's not just him abandoning Honda. Aston and Honda would have to split for it to be a repeat. But yeah, you're right. It's the concern that all of that potential is properly realised. The one thing I was wondering was, what chance of another Alonso Enstone reunion and Flavio Briatore giving his old mate a call, because and this isn't, I'm not suggesting he'll take a specific Alpine seat entirely. Who knows what they'll end up doing with either driver, how they'll get on in 2026. But if Alonso's fed up, if he's on the market, if he does want to continue because he just can't quite break himself away, the only real roll of the dice I can see in the short term would be to try and force his way into Alpine, which looks upwardly mobile again, got a Mercedes engine. Him and Flav are thick as thieves, aren't they? So I wouldn't be surprised if that becomes a bit more. It's already in Bahrain being talked about again in that kind of speculative kind of, could you see this happening? Like I had at least 3 or 4 people asking me in the paddock, like, what's he going to do? Could he go there? That sort of thing. It's not an active story, so I don't want it to be interpreted in that way. It just wouldn't surprise me if people continue to murmur about it through the year.
Well, you couldn't blame him, could you, if he thinks Aston Martin's going to be perennially at midfield at best and not be able to take the step to the next level? Then where better to go than to Alpine, a team with a consistent record of doing that in recent times. I think I probably should add to those options, it's a subset of the see it out option. He could just go pure mercenary, couldn't he? And we don't know exactly what the motivations are. He could just say, do you know what? I'm just going to sit here for a few more years, keep coining it in, pack my bank account for retirement. I wouldn't blame him for that. He's earned that right. And perhaps what you talked about in terms of there not being many other rivals for the seat if Aston Martin continues to struggle, that could put him in a strong position to say, actually, let's do a new 3-year deal and I'll just stick with it. If it gets good, great. If not, I am earning some serious money. Now, those questions came from the Race Members Club, so this is a good opportunity to tell you about our new special offer for the Race Members Club on Patreon. You can get 90% off your first month to get an idea of what it's all about. That's a short-term offer, so act fast if you would like to jump on that. And Scott, obviously we've done a lot of stuff with the Race Members Club. I mean, the latest thing we've done on the Race Members Club is me going to the cinema, which I'm entirely in favour of. I don't know whether that was a particularly good selling point for people, but I enjoyed it.
I said when we put that bit of content out, we had the perfect kind of combination for you, which involved a 1990s Formula One team, a trip to the cinema, and something for our film club offering, which is part of the members club, where we dissect documentaries, films, television shows, both new and old, if we find old ones to get into, including an incredible hour-long dissection between you and Val Horingi of Driven, the seminal racing film of our time. So that was absolutely perfect. And you had the pleasure of bumping into a couple of members there as well, because we were able to get hold of some tickets for patrons of the members club. So that was a nice little perk.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's always fun to run into, not just members of the Race Members Club in the wild, also just general fans of the race. There's lots of you out there, but particularly so with the Members Club, because there's so much enthusiasm there. And obviously we're going to be doing loads of stuff during the Australian Grand Prix weekend and beyond. So there's a good chance, if you'd like to get a bit of a taste of what's going on, we regularly answer questions every post-race podcast. We will have a section that's dedicated to questions from the race that we answer. But that's not the only opportunity to ask questions, of course.
Yeah, so obviously we've talked before on pods about how spontaneous we like to be with Members Club offerings. For example, I think there's a small chance on the Wednesday before Australia that I'll be at an event and have a few minutes with Nico Hulkenberg. So I'm going to grab him for a quick chat, which we'll probably put out exclusively within the Members Club. That'll be a short thing ahead of Audi's official F1 debut. But that kind of interaction with the members and the question opportunities, really good example. I mean, this pod already is a great example of it. So the Aston questions that we're getting through here, and you've woven into the structure of this pod, came from a batch of about 15 or 20 Aston questions that we got in over 120 questions during a Q&A we did across testing. So we've saved some of them because there's so many to get through. We're also, you're right, you've got the post-race podcasts. You've got a Q&A that we do after everyone with your driver rankings as well. And we're going to start doing short little snippets in the Members Club where we pick out questions that didn't make it into a full podcast recording, but we think are really interesting topics and should be answered. So we're going to be throwing out a few like shorter recordings, if that's one voice or a couple of people chatting about a topic, whatever. So really just collectively there, just want to emphasize how awesome it is to have that knowledge and that hunger for knowledge within the Members Club that asks really really intelligent questions, allows for nice informative discussion, that sort of thing. There are loads and loads of opportunities to do that around the start of the season, which is why we have this new offer, the 90% off your first month, because there's going to be a lot to get through. Just because we finished testing doesn't mean we stop learning. So the start of the season proper is a great chance to dive in and see what it's all about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that 90% off your first month offer is running now. Hit the link in the episode description, head to Patreon, search for the race or the Race Members Club to find out more. Well, let's move on a little bit more to Aston Martin's troubles. We'll go straight in with a question from the Race Members Club because I think it's a very, very good starting point for this section of the podcast. It's from Chris Wilkins, who says, "It seems that a narrative is forming that Aston Martin's issues are because of Honda. Is there any evidence to support this, or is it possible that Adrian Newey missed on the car design?" What do you think, John?
I think the problems kind of start with Honda because the lack of reliability and other compromises means the team hasn't made the advances in understanding with the car that it wants. There's been very limited mileage. It's almost unbelievable that day one in Barcelona, when Stroll stopped on the 5th lap, it finished testing with a day of 6 laps because it couldn't do any long runs, problems with the batteries, ran out of spare parts. So almost zero progress over the test. So until you get the fundamentals of the power unit aspects right, both the ICE and the battery, then the car, you won't find the limits of the car. And then the question is, how much do compromises to get that power unit working properly? It's clear they've got some overheating issues, temperature control with the battery, which is why they couldn't run for many laps in the Bahrain test at the end. So that's become a problem. Then that's going to trigger cooling compromises on the car. Then does that impact the aerodynamics? So everything boils from there. And I think with this rule set, the power unit has to be absolutely on it and perfect if the car's going to be unleashing any of its potential. And at the moment, the power unit basics aren't there, which means the car can't get there either.
And Scott, obviously you did a lot on Aston Martin during the test, and you've always done a lot of coverage of Honda in recent years, well, even quite a few years. In fact, I don't think there's any doubt that, as John says, the Honda power unit is the first order problem. Doesn't mean there aren't others, but it's the first order problem, isn't it?
Yeah, the very first order problem is it's unreliable. Something in it, and I don't think it's necessarily the same thing every time. What I was told is Honda picked out quite a few different faults over the course of testing and was gradually addressing them. But I think the process of addressing them was obviously longer than it would like, and the usage of parts required to address it on site just got it's kind of swallowed up the whole program. Basically, the first thing is it's unreliable. Things keep breaking. The engine can't run beyond a certain number of laps, it seems, without certain faults emerging. Specifics would be better. I would offer them if I could, but officially Honda's saying very little. They wouldn't put anybody up to speak properly during the test. So it'll be interesting to see between now and Australia, and once we get to Melbourne, whether or not a bit more kind of firm information comes out. The second order problem is there's definitely limitations within the technology. The suggestion is that that Honda basically can't recover energy to the maximum potential of that exists within the MGUK and within the regulations at the moment. So its recharging capacity is limited. That's obviously going to impact how much it then can deploy, because if we already know that these cars or engines are energy poor, and that's if you're doing everything you can within the potential of the regulations, and Honda is not at that potential. So that means it's unreliable, it's inefficient, and it's down on power over the course of a lap. What we don't know on top of that is whether there are specific Honda-related drivability problems, whether or not there are then limitations within that. So even if Honda was at the theoretical maximum of its own performance in terms of deploying power across the lap, is it doing that in as good a way as the other engine manufacturers can? For example, we've got no idea where Honda really stands on starts. I've seen a few practice starts, but we haven't really seen them to the level of what others have done either. So there are all these known and unknown limitations at the moment, and that's why I say there's a chance that Honda gets on top of this early, especially if they can. I think the best thing they can do is if they've identified where the limitations are within the architecture or the way that things are put together, that gets a reliability fix early, then you could see Honda make progress in leaps and bounds. The comparison I draw would be to 2017, when they started really, really bad, not as disastrously as 2015, their first year of those rules, but very bad. A big backward step from 2016, but that was because they'd made a massive change to the engine architecture. Now, that change and those reliability problems turned out to be the foundation of all of the progress that followed. It just required a disastrous 2017 to then get cleared, a change of environment outside of McLaren to the Red Bull family and Toro Rosso to be able to build on it. But they actually had a reasonable base once they'd sort of like just gradually unpicked all of the nonsense that was on top of it and all of the problems. So if that's the position that Honda's in now, and actually, the core product's not bad, it's just got a load of things getting in the way to start with, then you could see progress over the second half of this year, but especially 2027, for example. What we don't know is whether, there are core limitations within this that also means the potential's not very high.
Speaking of the potential of Honda, it's well worth having a look at a piece that Gary Anderson, our resident ex-F1 technical director, wrote for the race website, which is headline Gary Anderson, Test Disaster is the Kick Honda Needed, where he kind of talked through the problems, drawing on his experience working with Honda in his Jordan days, and actually why what's happened in the test could spur Honda into action. If you spur Honda into action properly in F1, history tells us it does do very well, even though there have been some very shaky starts there.
And also mustn't forget that in the homologation era, there are the additional development upgrade opportunities this year. And there could be a scenario where...
Please use the acronym, John. It's F1. We use acronyms. ADWO. Don't explain it. Just expect people to know.
So there is a scenario where actually, if they're so far off the pace, they can get 2 upgrades in this year. That's a better situation than being 1% off the benchmark in some respects, because you can target a second version of the power unit post-Miami. You can target another one for post-summer break. So there are clear steps that can come in if the power unit is absolutely miles off the benchmark. Once we find out who the benchmark is it Mercedes? Is it Ferrari? Is it Red Bull?
It's a question now, Scott, from Greg, who says, has Newey been too arrogant for his own good to the detriment of the team, given that they seemingly did nothing until he arrived, wasting 2 to 3 months?
I don't think it's arrogance as such, because that would obviously suggest that it's a personal issue with Newey and his own active role in Aston Martin not doing a good enough job. I think there's definitely timeline based. We know that he and Aston Martin have talked about aerodynamic development pretty much not starting in earnest until he arrived, which was after the first quarter of 2025 had passed. So they were already 3 or 4 months behind on that, which, suggests that either they had been doing aero work, but Newey came in and went, whoa, let's just stop this and we need to reconsider what we're doing. And then you push pause, a bunch of that work's wasted, then you start again later. Or they had more of a conscious decision not to put things in wind tunnels or whatever until Newey had arrived. So they were doing some work, but not wasting too much of their R&D allocation or whatever until he was there and could validate it. So Newey's delayed arrival has played a part, certainly. And what we don't know is in his position as managing technical partner versus towards the end of the year when he then basically took overall control of the team. Andy Cowell got marginalised and put into a different position, whatever fallout there may or may not have been behind the scenes there. We don't know what impact that had in terms of, the worst case scenario, I guess, or the sort of cynical scenario would be Newey's running around unchecked. There's no one there to kind of tether him to reality in terms of timelines, in terms of what actually works versus what theoretically he thinks could work. Versus the best case scenario of Aston Martin is now able to fully tap into Newey's creative potential and brilliant, almost unrivaled reimagining of how the cars work and being able to see it in his head and then put it onto drawing board and then put that into reality and so on. But that's going to take time. And the Aston Martin organisation has not had the stability required for a top technical organisation to thrive in F1. So I think it's going to be Newey's timing, it's going to be his role in it and how it actually fits together. And then it's also just going to be the sheer reality that you can have all the money in the world, you can have all the brains in the world, but that doesn't just magic up extra time for you to make up for deficits. So it's a complex equation, and what the balance is between those factors. And if there are any others that I haven't even thought of in that rant, how that comes together is massively unknown. There might not even be the case that Aston Martin fully understands what exactly the sort of recipe is there for where the car is right now.
I also don't think there's fundamentally a problem with Newey changing the car when he turned it, because they weren't doing nothing. They were developing the car, but the comparison point is the 1998 McLaren, isn't it? From memory, Newey joined, I think, in August, and he changed what they were doing with the car because he knew they needed a slightly longer wheelbase. They want that diagonal stability characteristics to be similar to the bigger cars of the year before. And those were key changes that made the McLaren MP413 dominant in 1998. But the difference was McLaren was a fully realised, strong F1 team that had returned to winning ways. The year before he was there, Aston Martin's a bit different. But we also have to remember that Aston Martin are better off with Newey starting late on what is this year's car and any problems that may have caused than just persevering with completely the wrong direction and then only changing it next year. So I'm not going to say being in the position they're in is good, but it's kind of short-term pain, longer-term gain will be the hope there. And there's a question from Motorsport Mike who says, is Newey starting to lose his edge given that a Newey car is no longer the guaranteed success it was in the past? I don't think there's any evidence to say he is losing his edge. I do have reservations about the way Aston Martin is set up, the team principal role, and obviously, all political careers end in failure. That's the saying, isn't it? So, there is sometimes a point where things move beyond us, but I don't see there's any evidence that that's the problem with Newey. I'm not saying that's not the case, just that there's no evidence that it is, especially with Honda being the first order problem. But he remains, he was never guaranteed success. You still had to put him in a team that worked, that had all the things it needed. and give him the time and the room to do it. And I think that's probably the lesson that Lawrence Stroll needs to have most at the forefront of his mind, is let this Newey thing play out.
It's almost the tech equivalent of Alonso, isn't it? Where you're all pretty sure that they're still at the peak of their powers, and that if everything comes together and they can unleash what they were once capable of, they'll be able to do it the same again. And this can be the environment that it happens, but you don't know for sure, and there's not really a concrete way of knowing that, especially when Newey's final years at Red Bull were so obfuscated by political power plays and strange dynamics within the team. So what one person said Newey was responsible for, another person would counter. His actual role and authority was quite badly diminished in terms of the narrative that certain people pushed. So, depending on who you believe, you could have a very different picture of actually how relevant Newey's been for the last few years and what contribution that it is that he's made. I think it would be lacking respect, and I think it would also just be a bit ignorant to suggest that Newey can't make an absolute top level contribution to a modern F1 car just because he's been around so long or whatever, and tech moves on and so on and so forth. I'm sure there are elements of the way that he works or the way that he sees things that are a challenge to integrate into the way a modern top F1 team runs. Teams have been open, even Aston Martin, about that, with his preference for working on a drawing board, for example, versus others that are, raised on working purely digitally in CFD or whatever it is. There are ways that you need to basically translate what Newey does into what the rest of the organisation then needs. But I don't think that necessarily means he's not past it from a tech sense necessarily.
And I think there's a truth that you've put that Honda engine in any of the cars on the grid, that team would have had as equally as shambolic pre-season. There wouldn't be any better situation, and we'd all be saying, "Oh, the technical director's done a terrible job. This isn't working." So I think this is a problem of the project rather than just the car. And I think it's one of timing, the timelines of Newey's arrival. And you can argue that Aston Martin would be better off going the Audi route, getting a car out in early January, get it up and running, understand the foibles, get some filming days done, approach day one in Barcelona, having already got a couple of 100 kilometres under your belt, and the pre-season shakes out. And you can play it safe and you can be conservative. But Aston's not a team that you don't hire Adrian Newey to finish fifth in the championship and make steady progress. You hire Adrian Newey and you spend hundreds of millions on new factories and all the investment and potential to target the win. It's just a question of what your timeline is for that success to be judged. As we kept saying, this is a project that may not reach fruition for 3 or 4 years. But I don't think we can say that the entire project's a failure and Newey's passed it and finished just because Honda's had a bad start to this rules era and it's going to face a really difficult start to the season.
Yeah, the simple fact is that the car's strengths and limitations are still something of a mystery because you're blocked off accessing them. Certainly from the outside, they'll have an idea in the team, but even then, they're so immature in terms of running it, and they've been battling so many other problems that I just think we don't know. Now, there's a portmanteau question from 3 people here, John, that I'm going to throw at you. Aaron Riley, Stuart G, Richard Randall, that I sort of smashed into one question. It's about the similarities of this situation with the size 0 McLaren-Honda of 2015, whether this car is having problems because it's too tightly packaged, as well as the unraced McLaren MP4 18 of 2003. Are those fair comparisons?
I think there may be an element of the car being super aggressively packaged. I've seen some photos from inside the garage with bits of the bodywork off, and you can see there's virtually zero room between the power unit and the bodywork. So Newey has been aggressive. And you can argue that is this car too radical, too aggressive for the state that the Honda's in at the moment? But this is the process you go through. If you don't push the boundaries, if you don't take things to the limit, if you aren't exploring these areas to find extra performance, you're never going to reach that target. You can play it safe forever. Aston Martin could create a team that's quite happy to finish 5th and 6th every year for the next 10 years if it wants to. It's not a very difficult thing to do. But if you want to win, if you want to push towards the front, you've got to take steps. You've got to be bold. You've got to be aggressive. And Newey's the epitome of that. You've hired Adrian Newey to create a super aggressive car that can take on the best. Whether that's the right fit today, who knows? You could argue that being conservative would put them in a better position as of today, and potentially a better position for Melbourne. But is it going to put you in a better position come Abu Dhabi, the start of 27? I don't think so.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think in terms of those comparisons, I think they're interesting stories in Newey's history, but I don't think they shed much light on what we know is the problem now, given the Honda problems, the gearbox problems we know. How this is the first gearbox this team's made since 2008. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're fair comparisons to the specific situation, but they're useful things to have in mind.
Yeah, they're not prophetic. They're just because it happened there, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work that you can say, well, that what happened there shows that this is what's happening now, or why it's happening now. There are interesting comparisons within it. The McLaren-Honda one of 15, for example, comes from McLaren being incredibly aggressive on their design, Honda not wanting to say no. There not really being a great working relationship there in terms of having the necessary communication and compromise on both sides, and that working all together with Honda just not being on the same level as the other manufacturers, because also it was a compressed timeline to get everything where it needed to be to work. So it was an absolute disaster. But when Honda completely redid its engine for 2021, right before it withdrew from F1, the way that was packaged and the way that the engine, the actual volume of space the engine took up and the way that everything was kind of woven in around it, that was smaller than the size 0 engine of 2015. So it showed that Honda can do it. The unraced McLaren example is a good one of how, if you to John's point about pushing the limitations and trying to be aggressive and that's going to be hit and miss. Like, you are not going to have a perfect strike rate of trying to push the boundaries of certain things and getting it right every single time. So that can lead to big delays, big disputes, uncertainty, lack of clarity. So some of that across both of those stories applies to what we're seeing now. Some of it doesn't. I am sure, because this is a new relationship, it's a new way of working, what Aston Martin will be demanding of Honda will be extremely high. Honda now operates and works in a different way. It's a slightly different organisation to the one that worked with Red Bull. It could be closer to the McLaren situation. There could be, I'm sure, opportunities that Honda has had to say, no, we can't do that, or we don't think that's possible, or we're in trouble, and hasn't wanted to or felt that it can, because they just haven't got that kind of working relationship exactly where it needs to be. It might come over the next 12 months. What I would be surprised by is whether or not any decisions that Newey wants to make in terms of car packaging or design, any element of it, has any worry about being, suffocated by committee or anything like that. We know that Newey has all power when it comes to those technical decisions and basically runs the team now. So if there is alignment, if they do get to a point where that working relationship is as strong as the Red Bull Honda relationship was, for example, that's one of the reasons why I think the potential of it all remains so high, because there should be total clarity on which direction to go in, for better or worse, but at least they will all be going in the same direction, and they should have the resource and capability of then maximising it.
Well, let's finish off with a look at the prognosis for recovery in the timeline. Scott, a question from Texas Will says, do Aston Martin and Honda have any real hope of fixing their issues this year, or are we looking at a more long-term road to recovery into 2027 or beyond?
I hinted at this before. I think it's more likely this is a repeat of what happened in 2017. I think there could be the basis of a perfectly competitive engine there, but at the moment it's all being shrouded by unreliability and specific limitations. Now, the big question is what can be done to untap the potential and also just make sure that the thing runs in the first few months of the year. I suspect that there's going to be quite a lot of low-hanging fruit there. So I'm not of the opinion that Aston Martin and Honda will be running around only doing, a dozen laps, 20 laps of the first half a dozen Grand Prix or first 12 Grand Prix, failing to finish more often than they don't finish, 4 seconds off the pace, that sort of thing. I'd be surprised if testing's not in the deer, but it's possible that it carries on into the season in some way. That said, I think it's a longer term journey to get to the front of the top of the engine pecking order. I think that's where the 2017 comparison is again useful, because over the course of the year there was still a lot of missed performance targets, reliability was bad, And obviously it did lead to the total McLaren-Honda divorce that season. But architecturally, there were a lot of the right decisions made for that engine that then allowed Honda to progress into 2018, get a much, much better performance and reliability base. And then we saw it then build up even further over the following years to become a race winner and ultimately a championship winner. There's not the possibility that there was back then to just throw money at the problem and spend hundreds and hundreds of millions a year developing endlessly to make sure that your engine's the best in F1. You know, there's the cost cap restrictions, the dyno restrictions, all of this. So that's why I think even if the base level of engine is pretty good, or even, you know, can be average this year, like bang in the middle of all the engine manufacturers, like progressing from that's going to be tricky, and that's going to be the best case scenario. I struggle to see Honda not being the worst engine manufacturer over the whole year, but let's see what progress it can make. I don't think it will get to, you know, podium finishing potential as a package in one season. If it does, that is an incredible turnaround from both team and engine manufacturer. It's not impossible. I just don't think it's likely.
Well, a chance for you, John, to make some predictions here from Krishna Prasad Koti, who says, do we have any hopes of Aston Martin winning a race or at least achieving a podium this year? And could they be in the mix for the championship?
Championship, no. Race win, highly unlikely unless there's a complete freak circumstance, and probably similar for podium. I can't see where they're starting from at this point and how far down the road Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull are with their power units and understanding, them being able to close that gap and overhaul them. There's even it's going to be tough for teams like Alpine, you know, McLaren, even McLaren at times. If you're mixing it at the front, the fight's for 7th and 8th place if you're off the back of that. So to try and think you can get into the mix and be fighting for third for anybody where they're coming from now is very, very difficult to do. Winning races this year is going to be incredibly hard for those top 4 teams because it looks close and it could swing around a lot. So I think Aston can make progress, Honda can make progress, and key to it going forward is where the rules end up. Are we going to end up with deployment and harvesting regs that favour Honda a little bit, because that can help them a lot more than progress they can make themselves. And then what they can do with Aduo, how far off are they? Is it going to be 2 upgrades over the course of the season? And can they make the changes they need to make? The only positive thing is that the testing was so bad that there's no hiding now from their problems, that they need to get on and solve them. There's no kind of pretending or thinking, well, it's not too bad, we can keep going, it'll be good. It's not going to be good unless they make changes.
I would love for them to be on the front foot in telling this story, because if there is a genuine belief within the organisation that serious progress can be made this year and you can get to the front of the midfield even in the same season, that's an astonishing turnaround for a car that can't do laps in testing and is going to Australia genuinely as an unknown whether it will finish the race with both cars. And I think people will be surprised if either car makes it out of Q1, for example, just because of the low base it's starting from. So yeah, they should be really, this is the moment to kind of make it very clear what they're struggling with, and how much of a mountain there is to climb. And you, even within that, you can still say all of the right things about how the team's in the best place that you've seen it internally, the people that are there are the best people they've ever had, the way that everybody's working at Silverstone and Sakura and all of their partners are pulling together is really motivational and great to see. All of that applies. This is where it's actually like the most valuable and most powerful, when you are banding together in a crisis to get things together. And then you take people on that journey through the year or through the next 2 or 3 years, whatever it ends up being. This was exactly what Honda did the last time with the Toro Rosso year, for example, and then the first couple of years of Red Bull. So whatever is possible this year, and when Krishna's point about winning a race or achieving a podium could come true, being able to find a way to make sure that fans really understand what has been gone through to get to that point is an amazing storytelling opportunity for Aston Martin and Honda.
Yeah, and I think a willingness to do that is often a reflection of where a team is in itself, in its culture, in its approach, and generally teams that try to clam up and just sort of hide it, it normally reflects things inside and not going very well. And so it's also an opportunity to show the qualities of the team that are going to long-term turn it into a winner. I think if they just go into their shell, that's not a very encouraging sign for the culture of the team. Right, the final question from Daryl Finch. If either Cadillac out-qualifies either Aston Martin on sheer pace come Melbourne, given all the investment, recruitment and expectation on Aston's part, where would that rank in the annals of F1 underperformance? Yeah, if that does happen, and it could, be pretty embarrassing, I think, because this requires Aston Martin, Honda to be right down at the low end of what they could have done, and Cadillac to be right at the very top. So, I mean, there have been worse things in F1, but it would be pretty embarrassing. But I think ultimately for the team, they've just got to take that on the chin, accept where they are now, and it's just about like any Formula One team. That's why it's stupid when people set their 100 race plans and all these things. You keep working through your problems. You get better. You put one foot in front of the other. If you keep going forward, keep improving, eventually you get there. And that's the mindset they've got to be. It's like work through the problems. Go get your priority lists right. Don't worry about necessarily where you are in Australia. It's the work you're doing, and that's the only way this team's going to get to where it does have the potential to go. But whatever happens, it's going to be a really, really interesting story to follow through the year, and hopefully the team makes it possible for everybody on the outside, including the fans, to do that. So thanks very much, Scott and John. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. Remember that 90% off your first month in the Race Members Club offer. And in the meantime, stay with us for everything you need to know from the world of Formula One.